I will talk today about two topics. The first topic is, can we say there is a fundamental right to populism? Once I had written it down, I realized it is defined too broadly, so I would narrow it to the question, is there a fundamental right to populist speech? And I will show to you that the reply to that question is both yes and no. And the second topic I will talk about is if there is something different regarding populist speech and human rights in the digital domain. In other words, if everything we say about populism and human rights in the non-digital domain is the same, or if something changes. Now, when I was asked to make this presentation, I started to look at the materials. You always need to look at materials if you make presentation. There were some surprises regarding this matter. The first biggest surprise was the term populism does not seem to exist in human rights discourse. It's non-existent. Human rights lawyers very rarely talk or write about populism. Can I prove it? I have read most of the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights for the last 10 years. I looked again. I found no judgment of the European Court of Human Rights which expressis verbis mentions populism in the text of the judgment. There are only a few dissenting opinions, and you know dissenting opinions of European Human Rights Court judges are sometimes a bit going astray. They write about poetry, whatever. In these dissenting opinions, you would find the term populism mentioned. Likewise, contrary to what people believe, in the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice of EU, the term populism is not encountered. Even in, there is a lot of literature where people analyze court cases, and they say, why didn't the court talk about it when it was obviously called to do that? Speaking about poverty, about other things. No, it's not existent. Scientific legal literature does not address the question of populism from the legal viewpoint. And there are very few, if at all, international legal instruments calling for governments and public authorities to deal with populism from the legal viewpoint. And perhaps a small conclusion for here, it's very difficult to find and present to you what is the legal definition of populism. Now, still, how can we argue? What would be the meaning of populism in human rights landscape? I knew very little about populism, so I was reading a lot of things, and I found this definition, which perhaps some colleagues who are more learned in political science might disagree or not, but we could say that populism, yes, is dividing people, good or bad, strong, weak, old, young, whatever, but the groups would be antagonistic. And because of that, I would say, and I think it's a correct statement, that populist statements are value judgments. Yes? When you give certain characteristics to people, if you say somebody is bad, it's a value judgment. Somebody is good, it's a value judgment. And of course, if we say that populist statements are value judgments, we could say, from the other side, that there is a long-established scholarly literature, but also jurisprudence of important courts, which say that not only those expressions which please us, but also those expressions which disturb and are insulting are protected under the freedom of expression. That is part of the democratic society. So I would say populist expressions are therefore, in a very strict sense, protected under freedom of expression. But now we enter into hate speech and discuss populism and hate speech. The definition of hate speech, a contrario to populism, is very visible in literature, in also court judgments. Yes? You understand hate speech as expression spreading hatred, justifying hatred, intolerance. This is hate speech. And you could find that there are a lot of different international legal instruments which form the basis to combat hate speech, both offline and in online dimension. There is also the issue of criminalization of hate speech, racist and xenophobic remarks, a topic I will not enter today. But as a side remark, Estonia is one of the very few countries, if not the only one, in European Union, which has not yet criminalized hate speech. Not yet, on the doctrine of freedom of expression. So, perhaps we could have this viewpoint. We know what is hate speech. We can sense what are populist expressions. But there is an overlap somewhere. You could have this viewpoint, that some populist expressions are hate speech, not all. I would rather think, from the perspective of human rights scholarship, it's more appropriate to have a very clear dividing line. There are populist expressions and there is hate speech. Populist expressions per se are not hate speech. So my first conclusion is populist expressions are protected under freedom of expression as long as these expressions do not transform into hate speech. Now, my second question here is, would it be justified to speak of right to populist expressions as a self-standing fundamental right? Not as part of freedom of expression, but a particular right. And there are two doctrines under which it could be done. One is the doctrine of rights implication. It means that some right or some social value is so important, we need to advance a new human right to protect it. Just to give you a loose example, let's say right to surrogate motherhood, yes? If it's a self-standing right. Or the doctrine of rights derivation, meaning that some right within a long-established right is so important that we need to separate it. Is there a justification? There are a few frameworks. One very important framework is already quite old, from 1984. It is a Philip Alston quality control framework. Because of time issues, I will not elaborate on it, but I'm saying the Philip Alston's quality control criteria of self-standing human rights is right now widely accepted in scholarly community, but it speaks about the international consensus which is needed to speak of a self-standing new human right. My question is, can this approach justify, theoretically taken, that we speak about right to populism as a self-standing human right? My reply is maybe. Suppose in a different world, United Nations tells us we need to adopt convention protecting populist speech. And if they adopt it, is there something to say that it's not justified to speak of populism or right to populism as a self-standing human right? Yes. We have some other frameworks, which I will, again, will be available for those who are interested later. All of these frameworks do not exclude the possibility that we speak in theory about the right to populism as a self-standing human right. But I don't think it is justified for the following reason. Here is a book which came out just this year in January from Cambridge University Press, where we have a very comprehensive study of the process how new human rights develop. And here you see, we have this thesis in the book of decrease of universality and abstractness. The study which we just published shows that the way how human rights develop has two possibilities. One is a decrease in universality. For example, rights for specific groups, when I speak about the rights to the elderly or the rights of the people with disabilities. These are not universal rights, these are rights only for those particular groups. Or the decrease in abstractness. It is not freedom of expression, it is something different. Here is the drawing which depicts the decrease of universality and abstractness thesis. On this basis, we could argue that the right to populist expressions does not meet the criteria of a self-standing human right, because we could say it is universal, but we would place it somewhere here. Yes. It's not abstract specific, it is not specifically abstract, it is more concrete right. So this thesis would exclude us of speaking of the right to populism as a self-standing human right. Now, I showed to you that the reply to my first question, whether right to populist expressions is a fundamental right, there are two possibilities to answer. One is yes, it is part of the freedom of expression. The other is no. We cannot speak about right to populist expressions as a self-standing human right. So here are the conclusions so far. Right to populist expressions is part of freedom of expression, and the decrease of universality and abstractness thesis rejects the claim that there can be a self-standing fundamental right to populist expressions. Now we can proceed to two other questions. How to differentiate between hate speech and populist expressions? And who has the discretion to make this differentiation? Who says, if I say that something to me seems hate speech, for someone else may not seem as a hate speech, and someone else might argue this is a legitimate expression covered under freedom of expression doctrine. Now we move then to the digital domain. Something is happening. Yes, it always happens. I don't know how to. What's the matter? Okay, perfect. Yes. We move on to populism and human rights in the digital domain. I have recently advanced the theory of non-coherence of human rights in the digital domain. It's published last year in a book. I'm currently writing a monograph on that for a major international publisher. And we can say that this theory of non-coherence tells us that human rights in the digital domain are characterized by, firstly, fragmentation of human rights normative sources and interpretation through discursive practice. Secondly, a multitude of actors with changing roles. Third, novel compliance mechanisms or their absence. Next one, systemic susceptibility to utilitarian considerations which are non-resilient in time. And finally, considerations which may change swiftly. To put it into more easy language, the former means that human rights in the digital domain are characterized by non-transparency instead of transparency, legal uncertainty instead of certainty, non-foreseeability instead of foreseeability, and secrecy instead of accessibility. Now, let's try to apply this theory to the matter of populist expressions in the digital domain. Now, if we look at the normative sources, definition of populism, we see that there is a similar absence of definition of populist expressions in the digital domain like in non-digital domain. What do I mean by that? You are perhaps all using Facebook, Twitter, other new technology possibilities. You may know that they have their own so-called community standards. It's easy to find from the internet. A community standard for Facebook is like a guideline, how they monitor the content which users are generating. I have looked through all the community standards of major online platforms. There is none of them mentions populism. They do all mention hate speech. None of them mentions populism. And, of course, they mention hate speech because there is a huge number of different international instruments which tell online stakeholders that they need to combat hate speech online. The second thing is, who does the balancing of hate speech, populist expressions? We see that the difference between the offline and online world is that the vertical governance model is replaced by horizontal governance model. That means that online intermediaries, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, whatever these are, now have the requirement to determine what is hate speech and what is not hate speech. Can they do it? Very briefly, there are two positions, of course. There are always two positions. One position is that these online intermediaries are well positioned to do it. And the second position is the states should never ask online intermediaries to determine what is hate speech and what is not. I personally also think that here is the matter of capabilities, whether online intermediaries are in a position to determine what is hate speech or not. Yes? Now, here is the matter of weight, which is another difference between offline and online world. In the offline world, we are accustomed to think that freedom of expression and right to privacy, which are both relative rights, have the same relative weight. In online domain, this assumption no longer holds. Why? Because depending on the policies of online intermediaries, the relative weight of freedom of expression may prevail over the right to privacy, perhaps because of economic considerations, perhaps some others, or the other way around. If companies really, very truly think they are bound by the new General Data Protection Regulation, they should favor more or put more weight on the right to privacy. This all means that the discretion to decide which expressions constitute hate speech and which are populist expressions is defined by private entities. That is a major change from the offline domain. The actors. On traditional way, we ask who is a journalist to decide when populist expressions transfer to hate speech. There are two approaches to journalism. The traditional approach is institutional, which means a journalist is somebody who works in a media enterprise. You always have an institution. Nowadays, this position is changing and the approach becomes functional. No longer is it important where the journalist works, it is important what is the function of a person. If you have something to say, you can do it. We are all journalists in that sense, if we have something to say. But what is important? When in institutional approach, you can see that the media organizations are bound by ethical standards, then in functional approach, this ethical standard disappears. The current image is then this. Online intermediaries are more and more obligated to block hate speech. The threat of sanctions or public condemnation may lead to over-blocking, blocking statements which are populist but not hate speech. But because of the threat what may happen, online intermediaries may wish to keep their platforms so-called clean from any allegation that they allow hate speech. So this is it. Expressions which in the non-digital domain might be characterized as populist, may be characterized as hate speech online. Now, the main conclusion then is, when the boundaries between populist and hate speech are not clear offline, this division becomes even more unclear in the online dimension. Now I have the final slide. Because of the previous, if somebody was to ask me, es-tu un populiste? Are you a populist in the digital world? I would say, je ne sais pas, I do not know. With this, I want to thank everybody who has stayed for the last session and wish you happy Valentine's Day. Thank you.